Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and welcome to my weekly video on the astrology. What's going on up there? Now, I've got two main themes I want to talk about. The first being the full moon, Thursday's full moon in Gemini, and the second, the massive Venus-Pluto-Saturn stellium, which is only about 24 hours later. So the end of next week is going to be really a powerhouse of influences. But I've got a third thing that I want to talk about this week, and that is a celestial dwarf. And I'll explain why a little bit later. So that full moon. The full moon in Gemini falls at 19 degrees 52 minutes, or we can round that up to about 20 degrees of Gemini. And it's an important full moon, both for the fact that Britain goes to the election. They go to the polls this week and vote in a new government and a new prime minister, or the same government and the same prime minister. And over in the USA, the Democrats are going to introduce the articles of impeachment. And that's a pretty big deal as well. And so maybe we can see why these very powerful influences are going to be present or prevailing over some pretty important things we already know are in the pipeline. And of course, there'll be other things that happen during the course of the week that definitely reflect these two big planetary developments. Full moons are always about closure and completion. And if you've got a birthday on or near, or let's say definitely on the 9th and 10th of June, then that full moon is right on your sun. So that process of closure and completion is very much in your kitchen. Now, it becomes a very good time to make a decision. But also sometimes events just come together and cause something that makes us feel that we've reached that point. We're drawing a line in the sand. And full moons, of course, raise the emotional temperature. And with that Venus-Pluto-Saturn combination, passions are going to be running high next week, whether we're thinking about passion in its rather nice sense of romance and sexual exchanges, or whether we think of it more in terms of adversarial situations and conflict. We get probably a bit of both. Now, I have to say that Donald Trump, as a Gemini, his birthday being in that sensitive part of the sign of Gemini, that full moon is right at the midpoint of his Sun-Uranus conjunction. Here's Uranus here, the little television area, and here is the Sun. And the midpoint, here we can see it very clearly defined because it is the North Node, or the nodal axis. Now, eclipses fall on the nodal axis, which is why we consider them to be rather fateful things. They're game changers. And in fact, as you can see from this chart, because the North Node is here near the Sun, that in fact Donald Trump was born on a lunar eclipse. So he has this mirror image because the moon will be on the Sun here at 20 degrees of Gemini, and the Sun will be here in Sagittarius. So it's a terribly important week for Mr. Trump. Now, it's also going to be an important week for Boris. And if we look at Boris's chart, here's another Gemini, and that full moon falls on his natal Mercury. It's not quite as intense or so powerful as the one that we've seen in Donald Trump's chart, but it's significant. And if we think of Mercury, Mercury in Boris's case rules the 12th house, excuse me, and also it rules it rules the 9th house. And what this full moon to me says, considering these areas of the chart that it's bringing out, is that it's time for a judgment. You know, we talk about closure and completion at a time of full moon, but we also talk about judgment. And I think the British public will have a judgment about Boris's performance. And we're going to see that in the result of the election. One last word I want to say about that full moon in Gemini. If you have a birthday on the 9th and 10th of June, you are empowered. I always say that when we've got a full moon in our sign, which is why I say it's a good time to make a decision because of that theme of empowerment. But of course, next week isn't just about the full moon, it's that Venus, Saturn, Pluto conjunction. And if we bring Donald Trump's chart up again so that we can look at it, let me explain. I have to go back here and find good old Donald, not Boris. And if we see here, Saturn is at 23 degrees of Cancer. We've got Venus at 25 degrees of Cancer. These are his natal planets. Right now, Saturn and Pluto are opposing this natal Saturn. So Donald has reached his Saturn opposition Saturn, and that's a very crucial time for all of us. It's a time of assessment. We throw some things out and we concentrate on others. We decide what's really worth it and what isn't worth it. And if you're born in 1974 or in 1946, you'll be sharing this Saturn opposition Saturn with Donald. Now, of course, that sounds great, the idea that we get to make an assessment about where we are in life. And it's good if we can do that. But, you know, with Saturn, we don't always get to make a choice. And what happens is other people decide what we can keep and what we have to throw out, what's going to work and what's not going to work. So it is a time of assessment and judgment again, in this case for Donald Trump. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about Donald a little bit later. I'm going to leave him now because what I want to do is get on to the third thing that I want to talk about in my video this time. And that's what I call the celestial dwarf, Eris. Now, lots of you who may know my work know that I don't really bother about asteroids or planetoids that are beyond the realm of the main occupants of the solar system. That's to say, Mercury outwards to Pluto. But I have to make an exception now with Eris, and I'll tell you why. I had a dream last night about her. She came into my dream. Her presence was vivid. And it was one of those big dreams because you could hear, see, taste, smell, and it was like a video that was rolling forward. And whenever something like that happens to me, I always pay attention. Now, Eris was discovered in 2003, actually in the October of 2003, but it was sort of officially discovered in the January of 2005. And I remember at the time being very interested. You're always interested when another planetary body is discovered. But for a while, there was a lot of argument about, you know, is Eris, is it a planet or is it just a celestial object, a dwarf? And eventually, astronomers came down on the side of the fact that it was a celestial dwarf. So I immediately failed to acknowledge it. But I'm not unacknowledging it now. It's a very interesting story about Eris's discovery because when, or at the time, planets are discovered, or in this case, celestial dwarfs, the times that we're living in and the circumstances about the discovery itself play into what we know about this planetary body. And when Eris was discovered, it was first thought that she was indeed a fully signed up member of the planetary team. But after a lot of argument and debate, astronomers decided she wasn't. And at the same time as they decided she was a celestial dwarf, they threw out Pluto as well. So Pluto got demoted because Eris had arrived. And Eris, of course, was never included in the first place in the planetary team. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the nature of Eris. Very interesting. Her orbit is tilted, so it's for 6 months it's at one angle, and for another 6 months it's at another angle. So we have a kind of split in her rotation. Her orbit, because she is much further out than Pluto, is 557 years. She takes that long to orbit the sun and that long to go around the zodiac. She makes Pluto look like a racing driver at 248 years. And there is really a relationship between the two. Eris is about the same size as Pluto, but she's more massive. She has more kind of rock, and so she's not exactly more dense, but she's just more substantial. And of course, when we look at Eris in myth, we find that she is a dark goddess. She is a creator, destroyer. And she's very much associated with the underworld. She was the daughter of Nyx. And she has associations with lots of other dark goddesses, Eris Kegel, and also the dark moon Lilith. And an interesting factor is that back in 1992, when I published, or when my book Divine Encounters was published, I spent a lot of time looking at the promising signs for the discovery of the 10th planet. And I believe this 10th planet should be called Persephone because of her relationship with Pluto, because she would be the planet beyond Pluto. And I explored all sorts of aspects of Persephone. The 6 months, of course, that she spent in the underworld, and the 6 months she spent out on the earth, and her creative or her creator-destroyer nature. So it is very interesting that as we get to all these many years later, and Eris is discovered, Persephone was one of the names under consideration, but because there was already an asteroid with the name of Persephone, they decided not to, and we ended up with Eris. And of course, she is also a very similar kind of goddess to Persephone. And if you go back to what I was saying a little moment ago about the fact that Pluto was thrown out of the planetary team at that time, and Eris was never included. One of the myths of Eris is that she was not invited to a wedding. And so she turned up at the wedding anyway, and she turned up with an apple. And on the apple was written, "To the fairest." And she threw that into the gathering. And of course, all the goddesses that gathered there scrambled to get the apple, and there was absolute bedlam and mayhem. Now, of course, that may remind you a little bit of something which is very seasonal at the moment, Sleeping Beauty. If you remember, of the 12 fairies were invited to the christening, but the 13th, Caraboss, was left out, and she wreaked havoc and declared that Sleeping Beauty, Aurora, the dawn, would die when she was 16 years old. And of course, you know the story. I'm not going to go on laboring the point, but there is a theme of being left out and revenge that is a quality of Eris. Now, because I am newly arrived at Eris, I'm not in full kind of flow about quite how we should interpret her, but she's obviously relevant at the moment. And when I tell you that right now she is at 23 degrees of Aries, and by the way, because of her slow orbit, when she was discovered, she was only 19 degrees of Aries, so she hasn't moved very far. But 23 degrees of Aries is in fact angling the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which will be exact when we come to the middle of January next year. So I think she has a message to give us. She is the goddess of strife and discord. She is the great destroyer. But like all creator-destroyer goddesses, and of course we look at this in astrology as well, this is about creation as well, because out of devastation and destruction comes growth. And I'm looking at the times we live in at the moment, and we can pick, well, there must be hundreds of situations out there on the world stage that are really full of strife and conflict. Even looking today at the destructive fires that are just outside Sydney, encroaching on the city, which are very concerning and worrying. But if we think about what fire does, for instance, it may destroy the land, the territory, the trees, but once the scorched earth is left, then it gives rise to the abundance of nature later. So I think what I want to end on really, and introducing really all these themes together, endings, beginnings, we have transformation, death and rebirth. Even if times seem to be very destructive at the moment, and we wonder quite what will happen as we get into the new year and we see some of these more intense configurations coming about. We need to really focus on that creative aspect of them, that out of this, in the vacuum created, will come new and beautiful growth. And I think we can apply that to our individual situations where we find ourselves right now, as well as when we look out onto the world stage. So I look forward to being here this time next week and speaking to you, same place. In the meantime, have a good week. Take care.